All right, good morning, everyone. So I am going to be providing for you a short video. Hopefully it's going to be within 10 minutes about major topics in AP World History. You should be watching this the night before the exam. Hopefully this helps you get the big general pictures of AP World History, and then I will give you supplemental links in the YouTube video description for you to also look at and check out. So if you're cramming right before the test, this is really good cram material. So without further ado, let's get started. So I'm going to share my screen and get into this PowerPoint. All right, start. All right, so major topics in AP World History. This is by obviously something I created. I'm going to divide it into time periods, 1200 to 1450. I'm going to talk about, some general topics. There's not going to be a lot of information on the slides. I recommend, again, going back, looking at other YouTube videos, looking at the Princeton Review Guide, and then using this as just a supplement to kind of bring stuff together. So from 1200 to 1450, the major topics are the Mongols. One major topic is about the Mongols, the rise of the largest contiguous land-based empire in world history. Remember, the Mongols originated from the Mongolian steppes. Genghis Khan unifies them, I believe, in 1279. Ooh, I need to go back and check that date. But he unifies them. They're a group of nomadic peoples that are very effective at war fighting because of their horses and their expert marksmanship using the bow and arrow. So very effective. They conquer large swaths of territory. They actually don't have a lot of cultural achievements, though. They kind of just assimilate or use the people and that they conquered to govern the territories that they conquered, and they really just want tribute from the territories that they conquered. They conquer parts of China, large sections of the Middle East, and large sections of Asia. So they're a huge, important factor in AP world history. They also help facilitate the spread of the Black Death. So we'll talk about the Black Death before we talk about the Trans-Saharan Trade route. Remember, all this is happening in that period between 1200 and 1450. They facilitate the spread of the Black Death because they provide relative stability for which the Silk Road trade route can actually flourish. The Silk Road trade route obviously, or not obviously, but connects parts of Asia and Europe. They provide political stability with which trade can flourish. They encourage trade to take place because they achieve benefits from trade. They can extract wealth from trade, etc. Outbreak of the bubonic plague then basically gets transported across the Silk Road and ends up in Europe, kills 1/3 or even 2/3 of the population, or 1/3 of the population of Europe, and leads to basically the death of feudalism, as there are a lot of lords that die. There are a bunch of feudal servants that begin to try to occupy noble houses, all kinds of instability that results from that. And so the Black Death is a major event in AP world history, major topic in AP world history as well. So going back for a second, the Trans-Saharan Trade route is another trade route. We talked about the Silk Road and linked it to the Black Death. The Trans-Saharan Trade route is another trade route that originates in Africa. So remember, North Africa at this time period is dominated by Arabs, who are Muslims. They are looking for gold. They trade gold. They are looking for gold, which a lot of African kingdoms and that have grown to empires because of this trade route possess. And these people here from below the Trans-Saharan Trade route actually go into the Saharan Desert in search of salt. So there's all kinds of trading that takes place. With trade and connectivity, a disease can spread, but also religion can spread as well. And so Islam spreads into parts of Northwest Africa. Of course, Islam does not penetrate the southern part of Africa. That just doesn't happen. But this Trans-Saharan trade leads to the growth of African city-states like the Mali Empire and the Songhai Empire. Major topics in that period. All right. Major topics in the period between 1450 and 1750. So we have Gunpowder Empires. We have the Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal empires are the major Islamic gunpowder empires at this time period. We wrote a DBQ about how they maintain power. They usually do this by developing a central bureaucracy. Empires and states that usually, can choose between those two dichotomies of centralizing power. The more power you centralize, the more you can expropriate or take from the people that you govern over, or a decentralized empire. The larger the empire, the more decentralized it usually is. Like, for example, the Mongol Empire was the largest contiguous empire, but it had a lot of regional khanates, meaning kingdoms and rulers of those kingdoms. For example, Kublai Khan ruled China. And so just remember that trend. The larger the empire, usually it's a more decentralized government. But these are the major gunpowder empires. Predictably, they use guns to help with expansion and consolidating their power. Gunpowder comes from Asia, China in particular again. It ends up in these gunpowder empires, and they use it to expand successfully. The Ottomans in particular were notorious for using big cannons. Those cannons helped them conquer large sections of Europe. We talked about Suleiman the Magnificent, who launches a series of successful campaigns in Europe before, and using gunpowder empire and gunpowder technology to be successful. They also use kind of different ideologies like absolutism, absolute rule. They have strong central leadership, strong authority in one particular leader. In the Ottoman Empire, it's the Sultan, who's kind of like a quasi means sort of religious and political leader. So he has a lot of authority in there. They use elite soldiers. They have bureaucracies, taxation systems. Pretty much through all empires and states in AP world history, they have a lot of those things, and being successful is dependent on good at those things for that time period. So these states were very good at taxing their people at least for a good portion of their time, training up soldiers. The Ottomans had the Janissaries, which were like Christian slave soldiers that they took from Europe. Also centralizing power in a bureaucracy. Mughal empires in India. Oh, this also kind of shows how far Islam actually spread. Yeah. Technology. So technology is huge in the period 1450 to 1750. One of the major pieces of technology is the printing press, which has a profound effect in Europe and then obviously spreads throughout across the world. Printing press, right? Books used to just be be able to be accessed by elite members of society. Gutenberg actually invents the first printing press in the 1500s. He invents this printing press, and it has profound repercussions because previously, obviously the most produced book in Europe at that time period was the Bible. It was such a religious society, and people had such a narrow-minded conception of life. They were just really kind of looking forward to the life after, which was supposedly eternal paradise. If you did all these good things, people were fixated on that. The printing press allowed them to focus on the here and now, because first of all, the most popular book printed was the Bible, and even just saying that, it led to individual people being willing to interpret what the Bible actually said. Before, you had to interpret what the Bible said from a priest, right? Because only they had access to the book. Also, you might not have been able to read and write, so it increases literacy over that time period. So having access to a Bible at your home. Also, Bibles were no just printed in Latin, which was an elite language. They were printed in local dialects. And so a book that is printed in a local dialect kind of like helps make language more concrete. And with this concreteness of language, so to speak, becomes more established national identity. So the printing press kind of leads to, has a kind of spiraling effect, leads to all these different crazy things that happen. It kind of helps establish or leads to nationalism. The way that it leads to nationalism is because you have to remember languages like English, French, Spanish, they weren't like concrete languages. There were so many different dialects because that were, you know, oh, this village speaks this dialect, this village speaks this dialect. But like the act of printing books in so-called, you know, standard English, like the King's English, etc., helped kind of standardize language and basically unify like these disparate people that really kind of didn't identify with people that they later think and interpret, you know, several years later, oh, those people on, you know, 40 miles away are French and I speak French too, which wouldn't have existed without the printing press. If I don't make sense, email me. The compass is another huge invention. The caravel, all kinds of shipbuilding technology that sets up the stage for European powers to become major maritime empires. So Europeans become major maritime empires. European exploration of the New World. On the left is Pizarro's conquest of indigenous peoples in Peru, the Incan Empire, his conquest of the Incan Empire. On the right is Hernan Cortez's conquest of the Aztec Empire. Both take place in the 1500s. You can find the specific dates. Remember, this is not really about specific dates, but you can find the specific dates either in the Golden Ticket. And of course, you should be reading the Princeton Review and watching other YouTube videos. But if you're cramming, you should definitely be watching this. So yeah, that's that. European exploration of the New World. Europeans obviously have very grand conceptions of themselves in this era of colonialism. There's different colonial powers that have claims in the New World in different regions. These are just two Spanish conquistadors that I give an example of. They usually commit brutalities against native and indigenous peoples there. In England, kind of has trouble kickstarting empire. The Spanish find gold pretty easily in like the you know, in the Central America and then South America, but otherwise, yeah. So look for specifics about which European powers get which territory, etc. The French get, you know, parts of Canada and parts of present-day America. England, of course, gets present-day America, etc. And those lead to repercussions. I think everyone's familiar with American history. You know how we came from the 15 colonies and stuff, so I'm not going to go into detail about that. But European exploration of the New World is a major topic. The Columbian Exchange is a major topic just because, you know, contact between the old and new world, so to speak, leads to all kinds of ecological exchanges. It leads to first all kinds of crops being exchanged. For example, potatoes come from the old world, and from the new world, they ship out maize to the new world, and that kind of leads to all kinds of good things, I guess, good things, so to speak, of the Columbian Exchange. There's all kinds of bad things as well. Diseases are exchanged. Native Americans did not build a good immunology to diseases of the old world because they just simply didn't have contact with stuff like smallpox, typhus, measles. And so they contracted all kinds of diseases from Europeans and died from them in large numbers. As many as 90% of Native Americans died from infectious diseases brought by Europeans. Colonialism. Colonialism is the subjugation of one people's to another, and it usually involves settling down in that territory. I actually don't remember Avatar. I don't really like Avatar, but Avatar is both like a kind of social commentary about colonialism, and it's also a social commentary, I think, about the Iraq War. Yeah, it was a social commentary about the Iraq War and how it kind of resembles colonialism in some people's perspectives, and I can see that. That's a legitimate criticism. I just didn't like Avatar because of the special effects. I just didn't think they were that great. but that's my opinion. Definitely look at this. Colonialism happens a lot throughout world history. European exploration in the 15th and 16th century kickstarts colonialism. It usually involves settling down. Colonialism is also predicated on assimilating different populations. Okay, mercantilism is an ideology. It's just a major ideology that kickstarts European colonialism in this era. It's an ideology that says maximize exports over imports, and that the true measure of a country's wealth is the amount of gold one has. So it's an economic ideology that its logic lends itself to establishing colonies, because then you would want those colonies to give back to you either gold and silver, foodstuffs, raw materials. It explains why the Spaniards were in search of gold and silver. When they made contact with indigenous peoples in South and Central America, and Mexico as well. But it also explains why when the English, which are originally searching for, gold and silver and don't find it, kind of settle for, making cash crops or developing, farmland to eventually be or using resources to eventually be exported to the mother country. The mother country makes a manufactured good and sells it back to the colony. So basically, it maximizes its exports over imports. So yeah, mercantilism is an important ideology that you can list for like contextualization if you're talking about European colonialism or imperialism in the 16th and 15th century, late 15th century, I should say. All kinds of forced labor comes with European exploration of the New World. In particular, the Encomienda system is established early on. There are critics of the Encomienda system that say it is basically slavery, which it was. It was enslavement of indigenous peoples, but for various reasons, such as like the mass extermination of indigenous peoples that were dying from diseases. Also, the fact that the Spanish priest Bartholomew de las Casas actually criticizes the Encomienda system. Europeans eventually switched to African slave labor. The first African slaves to touch place in America or to, I guess, land in America. It happens in 1619. There's this great project out of the New York Times, which I'll include in the description, called the 1619 Project, that talks about the lasting effects and legacies of slavery to this day. Slavery is obviously a brutal institution. It's a brutal form of coarse labor. There was a lot of whitewashed history, I think, of course, in Jim Crow America. If you don't know what I mean by Jim Crow America, then wait till AP US history, or maybe you'll have a teacher for AP Government that will talk about Jim Crow America. But it's definitely it's definitely a very brutal institution. Some people try to whitewash it and say it really wasn't that bad. Like in Gone with the Wind, for example, slavery doesn't look like this horrible institution, but it really is. This is a scene from 12 Years a Slave. If you haven't seen 12 Years a Slave, it's a very good movie. It's very hard to watch as well. But slavery is abolished in no small part to the Enlightenment, which we'll talk about later. Also taking place during this time period are the Protestant Reformation and Catholic Counter-Reformation that take place in Europe and lead to all kinds of wars, but they also have repercussions throughout the European colonies for obvious reasons. So the Protestant Reformation, this is kind of almost a direct result of the printing press as well. Martin Luther is this Franciscan monastic, or he's a priest, or actually, my Catholicism is now actively being questioned. Martin Luther, who is a religious man that is affiliated with Catholicism in some sense, nails 95 theses to a door. This could be a fake story, could be a real story. that basically outline the abuses and corruptions of the Catholic Church. So he says the practice of selling indulgences, which is basically the Catholic Church selling a ticket into heaven, was wrong. I think everyone agreed today that it is very wrong and corrupt. He emphasizes a individual interpretation of the Bible. He says that you really don't need priests to mediate the Bible, and he also kind of kickstarts the Protestant Reformation, which challenges the authority of the Catholic Church. There are all kinds of European monarchs and elites, and also lay people, people that are common people that get behind this idea, that become Protestants, and what have you. The Catholic Church launches eventually the Catholic Counter-Reformation, which is in part an idea of reforming their church institutions, because they realize that, yeah, well, one, Martin Luther's kind of right, even though they kind of wanted him arrested at one point, but also it's also more activist, right? They developed like the Jesuit Society, which is kind of like a missionary group. They try to reconsolidate territory. The Catholic Counter-Reformation is kind of the response to the Protestant Reformation. And then there's all kinds of holy wars that take place in Europe at the time because of that, because of the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Counter-Reformation, or because of like tension between Protestants and Catholics that have repercussions for the New World. Okay, so the Enlightenment actually takes place shortly after the Protestant Reformation, Catholic Counter-Reformation. It's this philosophical movement, which the biggest, it contributes to all kinds of writing, particularly it starts in France and then spreads throughout Europe, and then of course has repercussions throughout the whole world thanks to European colonies. So we talked about the idea of the social contract, which is this major idea in political philosophy, where before in Europe, people thought that the authority of the king and the legitimacy of the king came from divine right, that God ordained the king to rule. Thomas Hobbes questions this idea. He says that no, a long time ago, people gave their rights to government and kings to protect them from anarchy, because nobody wants to live in an anarchical society, because yeah, I can do whatever I want, but I might get my throat slit at night and everything taken away from me. So I give power to the king or the sovereign. Although this is not legitimately considered as the right way that states develop, which is what he's trying to like kind of answer, states and governments develop, it has repercussions. Just the idea of it being the way states and governments get legitimacy and they develop has repercussions, because it implies that suddenly kings aren't, ordained and installed by God, that they have the right to be replaced or overthrown by the people if they misabuse the power and trust that was given to them by the people. There are all kinds of iterations of social contract theory that develop, more liberal iterations, meaning iterations that kind of emphasize more political and individual rights as opposed to the importance and centrality of the king, such as John Locke, who emphasizes natural rights. We've all talked about John Locke before. You've talked about it in 8th grade and 7th grade, I believe, too. And Montesquieu. This leads to political revolutions, right? So it inspires political revolutions to take place. The American Revolution, Thomas Jefferson, in the Declaration of Independence, basically plagiarizes John Locke's ideas of natural rights into the Declaration of Independence. The Constitution is an attempt to make a social contract. So there's all kinds of inspirations that you see from political that impacts political revolutions. The French Revolution as well, influenced by Montesquieu. They create the Declarations of Rights of Man and Citizens. There's all this emphasis on individual rights as opposed to the centrality and the importance of the king. Also, there are all kinds of political revolutions that happen in Latin America. See the full list too. So like there's the revolutions that happen in Mexico. There's the revolutions that get kickstarted by Simón Bolívar, who actually is inspired by Enlightenment philosophy because he was educated in Europe. Napoleon is kind of related to the topic of political revolutions because Napoleon eventually kind of, kind of corrupts. After the chaos of the French Revolution, people are getting their heads chopped off because they're believed not to be revolutionary enough, and people are super paranoid. Under Maximilien Robespierre, another government comes into power, and then that government is then overthrown by Napoleon Bonaparte, who calls himself supreme ruler. So you can say on one hand, it seems like Napoleon almost corrupts the ideas of the French Revolution because they were trying to avoid having so much power in like a king or a monarch type figure, and Napoleon is basically that. But also in some ways too, Napoleon creates like this whole different system of laws. He also does all kinds of, has all kinds of legislation that allegedly protects like the values of the French Revolution. Yeah, so it's a little bit more complicated than that, but he invades half of Europe. This causes all kinds of disruption because remember, Europe has colonies. So the colonies are then have to ask this question: do we have to obey, like, do we obey the people that the French put into power? For example, France invades Spain, and then the colonies in Spain are like, well, and Napoleon installs, I think it's his nephew, into like the monarch position in Spain, and they're like, well, should we obey them? And that question kind of contribute and combined with Enlightenment philosophy, or maybe in social and political inequities, leads to revolutions. Last time period, 1750 to 1900, the major topics of the Industrial Revolution. We talked about this at length. The Industrial Revolution has all kinds of pros and has all kinds of cons. The pros being that it leads to mass production of goods and services. The cons being, child labor, poor working conditions, pollution, etc. There's all kinds of responses to the Industrial Revolution. Labor unions develop to get better wages. There's all kinds of legislation that's eventually passed in Britain related to child labor. Industrial Revolution eventually spreads throughout Europe, and then some countries try to industrialize either to take action, either as a kind of like a way to protect themselves from Europeans, because Europeans that industrialize become imperializers again. And the reason being, we'll talk about this when we get to the next slide. Some countries fail at industrialization because they perceive it as like impure, like China, for instance, at one point wants to industrialize because Europe's basically trying to carve it up into spheres of influence. But there's all kinds of revolutions and chaos that takes place because people are like, oh no, we shouldn't do that because it corrupts our culture and we become impure. New imperialism. So new imperialism is kind of related to industrialization because countries that industrialize first kind of become hungry for markets and resources. You need resources to fill up factories. They can't turn to the Americas because the United States just broke away and the United States says, don't come back into the Americas, Europe. Then there's all kinds of Latin American revolutions that take place, and that was super costly. And so they decide, well, let's go and carve up Africa, and let's go and carve up China. So that's exactly what happens. China is divided into spheres of influence. There's no actual physical colonization taking place. Africa, on the other hand, experiences colonization. And then we talked about a long time ago, like Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart in Heart of Darkness, and how brutal colonization was. And this takes place around the 1880s to 1914, the scramble for Africa. And Europeans basically take over the whole continent and exploit it for resources. But they justify themselves by saying, oh, we're doing this to civilize them. It's la mission civilistrice. We don't want to be here. But they really do because they want the resources. And then one response to the Industrial Revolution is Marxism. This is the last slide. Marxism is an ideology that criticized capitalism as immoral and dehumanizing, and said the world was moving towards communism. Although Marxism is an important ideology that takes place, Karl Marx is an important thinker that criticizes capitalism, etc. Marxism, the more important effects of like Marxist thinking and Marxist ideology is that it eventually leads to communist governments in Russia first in 1917. That is actually not covered because this AP test is only going to cover the period between 1200 to 1900. But I bet you would get like maybe even the complexity point by talking about if like Marxism was pertinent to your DBQ, but talking about eventual communist revolutions that take place in China and Russia. Okay,